I have a confession to make. My top 10 wide receivers have changed. I've altered them, and I've decided to rank the top 20 wide receivers in the 2024 draft. Now, as I've mentioned before, this is a loaded class. It was hard to rank the guys 15 through 20 and leave a couple names off. That's how good it is. And here's how we're going to break it down by tier. You have the NFL role, a guy who could just be like a rotational piece if some injuries happen. The upside role, which is maybe like you're on special teams, but if you get a chance, you could really be a wide receiver 3, maybe even a wide receiver 2. Then it breaks down NFL wide receiver 3. You're in a starting rotation, but not the guy. Wide receiver 2, you could maybe be the guy 700-800 yard seasons, but still not the number one option for a team. Then 1,000-yard receivers. So these are like the top 20 to 25 wide receivers in the entire NFL upside. And then a clear-cut number one wide receiver for their offense. Yes, there are multiple guys in this draft who can do that. Some drafts we don't get any. So with all that said, let's start with the number 20 receiver in the NFL draft. And that man's name is Malachi Corley out of Western Kentucky. That is a smaller school, but he did produce there. And it wasn't just 1 year of production. I mean, his big year was 2022, where he has over 100 catches, nearly 1,300 yards, but then he follows that up in 2023, 2 less games, and nearly puts up 1,000 yards yet again, 70 plus catches in all 3 seasons where he actually got playing time. Now, the positives to Corley's game are just how elusive and dynamic he is. He was the number 1 receiver in yards after the catch last year, averaging over 9 yards after the catch per reception. I mean, just insane. He has the power, the speed, the footwork, and he's a former running back, so all this makes sense as to why he's so dynamic with the ball in his hands. Now, Corley didn't run at the NFL Combine, but as you can see here, at his pro day, he ran in the mid to high 4.4s, which is always sketchy. He's probably a 4.5 receiver, if we're being honest, which really isn't all that great, but based on his size, it's okay. Because he's about 215 pounds. And now for the downsides as to why he's not like a top 10 or 15 receiver, there are concerns about how his college production will translate to the NFL. He earned most of his yards off screens in college, and 38% of his targets were behind the line of scrimmage. So watching Corley's tape, I think he'll definitely have a role in the NFL as soon as his rookie year, especially if he goes in the 4th or 5th round, but this is a guy that really needs the right landing spot and coaches. Now, the next man up as we stay in the NFL role tier here is Luke McCaffrey. And yes, this is Christian McCaffrey's brother, and if you didn't know, he actually ran faster than Christian McCaffrey at the NFL Combine. Now, Luke McCaffrey spent 5 years in college, and it was pretty unconventional. He started all the way back in 2019 as a quarterback for Nebraska, but he just never got any real playing time as a quarterback. In 2019, he got a couple reps, 2020, nothing, so he transfers to Rice in 2021, doesn't get anything, and then he finally becomes a receiver in 2022, and has a good year. He has over 700 yards across 10 games, 70 yards, over 70 yards per season in your first ever year as a receiver is pretty solid. And then you can see his best year was 2023, just a year ago. Everything hits career highs, receptions over 70. He has nearly 1,000 yards, averaging 14 yards per reception, and this guy just didn't drop any single pass coming his way. Now, of course, the competition at Rice wasn't the most elite. He wasn't facing the best defensive backs in the country, but for a guy who learned the wide receiver position on the fly, it's still pretty good and noteworthy that he had over 80 yards per game in his 2-year career. Now, McCaffrey mostly played slot in his college career, but he has the body type at 6'2" and 198 pounds, and on his limited sample of outside wide receiver production, this can definitely translate to the NFL where he's not just going to be pigeonholed into the slot. Now, the downsides to his game are probably obvious. He's only been a receiver for 2 years, so there's still a limited route tree. He's a little bit of a raw route runner in general, but there has been flashes of upside, and he kind of reminds me of Tyler Boyd. Now, the next man up is our wide receiver 18. We stay in the NFL role tier here, and this is going to be Jamari Thrash. He spent his final season last year at Louisville. But before that, he played 4 seasons for Georgia State, where he broke out in his 4th year there in 2022, having over 1,100 yards, 60 catches, and a career high 18.4 yards per reception. But again, this was smaller school production in your 4th year there, which means there's some concerns. Because then Thrash transferred to Louisville in his age 22 season, and all of his production dropped down while he became more of a slot wide receiver, averaging just 13.6 yards per catch. So now the big question becomes, was all of his production at Georgia State in 2022 just a flash because of the weaker competition, or does he legit have those skills? Well, I think it's a little bit of both. He was at a new program, dealing with an injury while there, and put into a new role, so that's surely going to affect your production. And when you look at his strengths, he had a top 3 receiving grade in this class and was top 10 in yards per route run, ahead of the likes of Rome Odunze. So we know he broke out, but that was at Georgia State, a smaller school. Does that taint things? That's the question that we're going to have to ask ourselves, and NFL teams will have to ask, and we just won't know until the draft. So now we go to my wide receiver 17, Johnny Wilson, and this is the upside tier. It's really going to depend on where he lands, but I think he has the ability, Johnny Wilson, to be a top 5 or top 10 receiver in this class. And the first thing you're going to notice about Johnny Wilson is just going to stand out to you. He's a giant. He is 6'6" and like 250 pounds at the wide receiver position. Now, realistically, he weighs like 230 pounds, which is still insane for a wide receiver, and he said he's playing receiver, not tight end, and I think the tape makes sense as to why. You can see it on film. Look at this speed right here. A 4.52 for this type of dude. He's an elite athlete for his size, 98th percentile speed score, 78th percentile burst. So here's what you need to know about Wilson. He actually started his career at a different program, Arizona State, where he just really didn't play much. He had like a couple dozen catches through 2 years. But then he transferred to Florida State, where he had his best season in 2022. He was basically their their leading receiver, about 900 receiving yards, averaged almost 21 yards per reception on 80 targets. Now in 2023, his production dropped. He saw 200 less yards, and it was 2 less games, but we have to add some context here because he was competing with a new teammate in Keon Coleman, who transferred from Michigan State, and Keon Coleman is also a prospect in this year's draft who's been getting some late first, early second round hype. So yeah, that's a lot of competition you have to deal with, and Florida State didn't run the ball or didn't throw the ball all that much. Now here's what Johnny Wilson does well. He has NFL size and speed, and he wins contested catches. He's also highly explosive for his size. Now the concerns that I saw on tape were mostly against press coverage, and the route running was somewhat of a concern, but way better than people are making it out to be. This is not a guy who's just a tight end. He's a receiver in the NFL, but my biggest issue was just the drops. This guy's hands were not consistent, but that is not sticky heading into the NFL. It usually gets resolved. My wide receiver 16 is Malik Washington. He's in the upside tier, and he's one of the more polarizing players in this year's draft class. Because as you can see right here, he spent his first 4 seasons at Northwestern, not a school known for throwing the ball, and because of that, he just never really had any production. You can see his best years are 500 and about 694 yards, nothing crazy, nothing like NFL caliber. But then in 2023, he transfers to the ACC and he goes to Virginia, and he has his monster breakout year. Washington put up 110 catches in just 12 games, averaging over 9 receptions per game and over 1,400 total yards. So here's what you should know about Washington. He was one of the most productive and efficient wide receivers in the country last year, but he was mostly a slot receiver, seeing 92% of his snaps out of the slot. Washington ranked 2nd in PFF wide receiver grades last year, only behind Malik Nabers, and was 5th in this class in yards per route run. So those are just some examples of just how productive and efficient he was, but probably his best traits are his balance, quickness, and reliable hands. But there are downsides to his profile. I mean, he's not a top 10 receiver for me for a reason, and that's because a lot of his production was at a smaller school or a smaller program in Virginia, and he's just 5'8". Now, he does make up for his size with his weight. He's 190 pounds. He's kind of built like Rondale Moore, and Rondale Moore was one of the better receivers coming out of that draft class, and I would say that this is probably the same spot where we can see Malik Washington getting drafted in the 2nd or 3rd round. And as for the concern about the 5th-year production, yeah, that's a real concern. Why'd it take so long? Maybe because 4 years at Northwestern, they just weren't throwing the ball. That could be a possibility, or was it just his skill set? Player Profiler, this website we're using, compares him to Zay Flowers, and I think this is a good comparison. Zay Flowers had a lot of slot production, a little bit more outside production than one Malik Washington in college, but he was also a slower combine tester, a little bit smaller, and was like a wide receiver 2 type player for the Ravens. So there's our first 25% of the wide receivers. Now let's get into the top 15. And this takes us to our first guy in this new tier that we are starting, the wide receiver 3 tier. A guy I think who can come in right away, Javon Baker out of UCF, and be immediately a wide receiver 2 for a team, but of course has upside to be more than that. Now he actually committed to Alabama, but he just didn't get on the field. In his first 2 years there, he only had 7 catches, but you can't really blame him because he was playing behind Heisman winner Devonta Smith and also first round pick Jameson Williams. But once Javon Baker transferred, things started to work out in his favor at UCF almost immediately. You can see in 2022, 56 catches, 800 yards. In 2023, another 50 catches and over 1,100 yards, averaging 22 yards per catch. So in his career at UCF, he was averaging 17 yards per catch, which obviously that means he's a downfield receiver, and his combine speed wasn't all that great, his 40 time, but based on his GPS tracking speed, it's still pretty good. His real game speed, down the field, straight line speed is solid. So what Baker is known best for is definitely his jump ball ability downfield. He has reliable hands, and he is explosive. I mean, honestly, if he went to a bigger program like where he started in Alabama and had this type of success, he'd easily be a top 10 receiver in the draft, but you have some reservations since the production was at UCF. And some other concerns were his inability to break tackles and consistently separate. So you're talking about a jump ball receiver who has reliable hands and was solid in the red zone. He kind of reminds me of the Packers. I've said this before, wide receiver in Romeo Doubs. Now our next wide receiver is Jermaine Burton out of Alabama, and I wanted to put this guy in the wide receiver 2 tier like so badly, but there's a couple of reasons why I couldn't. Now Burton actually started his career at Georgia where he had a lot of competition. He played next to guys like Brock Bowers, Ladd McConkey, and Adonai Mitchell, who all might go in the first round of this year's NFL draft. Now despite the competition, Burton still produced at Georgia. He put up over 400 yards in both seasons, 55 targets in his freshman year on an 18% target share with all of that competition. And after those 2 seasons at Georgia, he transferred to Alabama where he had career high numbers in each year. Almost 700 yards on 40 catches, then almost 800 yards, averaging over 20 yards per catch. He led this Alabama offense in receptions and yardage during that time. Now Burton is best known for his ability to stretch the field. He ranked top 10 in college deep targets of 20 plus yards last season. So that's the type of player that he is. And then at the NFL Combine, he tested a little bit better than people were expecting. People thought he'd be fast. The 4.45 40 time is solid, but he showed really good burst in his jump drills at the Combine. 91st percentile burst score, obviously great. But there are downsides to his game. One of them is just his overall blocking, and the next one are that there's apparently character concerns. And you can look up some of the reports that are out there, but more and more, I didn't really want to have to touch on this, but more and more it's coming out from prominent NFL scouts, reporters, and mock drafters that, yeah, these concerns are taking him off the boards of some NFL teams, which means I have to translate that to you. We get to my wide receiver 13, Ja'Lynn Polk, and he is the first wide receiver. Round of applause into our wide receiver 2 in the NFL. I think immediately when this guy's drafted in maybe the second or third round, he can be a wide receiver 2 for any team. And Polk was one of those 3 wide receivers at Washington, Polk, Jalen McMillan, and Rome Odunze, that are all going to be NFL draft picks this year. So he had that elite competition and was still able to produce. And he produced for multiple seasons. Right away in 2022, after coming back from an injury the year before, almost 700 yards. And then in 2023, his final year, big breakout year of almost 1,200 yards and 69 catches. Now, Polk is known for his elite downfield skill set, his ball tracking, and reliable hands. I would probably say out of all the guys I watched, around 30 receivers, he has the best hands in this class. And not only does he win contested catches, but he also picks up yards after the catch, which is rare for that type of a player. And there's another one of those guys in this video that we'll talk about shortly. Now, the downsides to Polk's game are his overall route tree is more of a vertical threat, and his overall blocking. So maybe his role is somewhat limited in the NFL, but I could see him working out of the slot, and he has really nice size, 6'1" and 203 pounds. The question would be his speed. However, at the NFL Combine, he goes out there and he has a fine time. I mean, it's not elite. A 4.52 for his size, though. You can see his speed score above average and his burst score well above average. So these were nice things to see. In my opinion, he tested better than expected. So you're talking about a guy with maybe the best hands in the class and wins at the catch point and after the catch. Yeah, I think he's definitely NFL ready. Next up is my wide receiver 12, Keon Coleman, and I do put him in the wide receiver 2 range, but you can even throw him in the wide receiver 3 range. Like, he's falling for me. He was a top 10 receiver when we talked about that video. I said he was a borderline top 10. Now I feel a little bit better with him at like my wide receiver 12, but I could see him even dropping 1 or 2 spots below Polk and a Javon Baker. Let's start with a couple of positives. He's an early declare. He's still just 20 years old, one of the youngest wide receivers in this draft class. And since he's only 20, he only had 3 college seasons. His first 2 were at Michigan State. Didn't play a lot the first year. His second year was his best year in college overall, almost 800 yards, and this was while competing with Jaden Reed, who went on to be a solid rookie receiver for the Packers. Coleman then transferred to Florida State in his final season, where he played alongside another prospect in this class that we just talked about in Johnny Wilson, and he actually outproduced Wilson in terms of raw receptions and receiving yards. So these are all positives, but the concerns are he just never had a breakout season in college, and he just doesn't have great speed. And I'm not just saying that because of his slow 40 time at the NFL Combine. You can see it on tape. Now, he's a fine contested catch guy, but when you don't do much after the catch, it's a little bit of a concern. It means that he might have to adjust in the NFL, kind of like what Amon-Ra St. Brown did when he adjusted to becoming more of a slot wide receiver, since he didn't have elite speed to win on the outside. Because when your best trait is contested catches, once you move up to the pro level against tougher defenses and defensive backs, that doesn't become as consistent in terms of production, and even less consistent when you don't have a great quarterback. So the more that I watch him, the more that he becomes a risky prospect. I do think if he can get transition in the right role into the slot, he does have top 10 wide receiver upside, but that's like the specific case point that he might have to get to. Next up is my wide receiver 11, Xavier Legette, and he is indeed in the wide receiver 2 tier here for an NFL right away. He is rising a lot for me in this class, almost a top 10 receiver, and might even get there by the time the draft comes in a week or 2. Now, Legette spent 5 seasons in college. Of course, there's that COVID year in there. You're getting a lot more 50-year seniors coming out this year, where in his final season, he had a massive breakout, over 70 catches and over 1,200 receiving yards. Now, the type of receiver that Legette is honestly really interesting. He's over 220 pounds, so he's a bigger receiver. He's also athletic. We'll touch more on that in a second, but he's a contested catch guy who picks up yards after the catch like a Ja'Lynn Polk, except he's more athletic. Because when he showed up to the NFL Combine, he weighed in at 220 plus pounds, and then he ran in the 4.3s, which is very rare for a guy that size. 98th percentile speed score, showed elite burst, 89th percentile burst, which makes sense based on his jump ball ability. So this is a legit wide receiver in terms of his size, his ball skills, and his after the catch ability, but yeah, there are some concerns. Legette didn't have any college production until his 5th year at South Carolina. In fact, his previous 4 seasons combined, he had 432 yards, so like 108 or whatever yards per season. I think that's spot on. 108 yards per season, that's not great. Now, ultimately, I'm in the camp that Legette is a fine prospect, and some of his early career issues may have been due to him losing as a young man both of his parents and being in a motorcycle accident. Those were separate occasions, all 3 of them. Plain and simple, I think the guy is a special athlete both at the catch point and after the catch, and yeah, he's my wide receiver 11. We have cracked the top 10 wide receivers, and it has changed, and it has changed immediately with my number 10 receiver out of Michigan, Roman Wilson, who is in our tier right here as being an immediate wide receiver 2 in the NFL. And maybe immediate is a strong word, but like by the midway point or the end of the season, I think he has that potential. I think he'll be a 2nd round pick in the draft. He spent 4 seasons at Michigan where his production peaked in his final year last year, 48 catches, 789 yards, which might not seem crazy, but this was a Michigan offense that ran the ball 60% of the time, ranked outside the top 100 teams in passing rate. In 2023, Wilson actually ranked 2nd in PFF receiving grade in the Big Ten, behind only Marvin Harrison. So now you might be wondering, what are Wilson's best traits? Well, he's a speedster who was used all over the field at Michigan, both in the slot and out wide, and despite being a smaller receiver, he has great strength, which helps him in the blocking game. So those are the strengths, but we also have to touch on the weaknesses, which would be his after the catch ability and his overall route tree at the NFL level. And now what I mean by that is, can he be be more than just a slot receiver once he gets to the NFL. In college, he was definitely able to do that, but does that translate as a smaller receiver to the NFL? But you're talking about a guy with elite speed, 4.39 speed at the NFL Combine. He's great at the catch point, and he likes to block. That's a coach's dream. He's going to find a nice role in the NFL. Now to my number 9 wide receiver, and again, my top 10 has changed since the last time we did this video. Xavier Worthy has been dropping for me. I think he was like my wide receiver 7. Now he's my wide receiver 9. And look, if you don't know anything about Xavier Worthy, here's a couple things you need to know. He's only 165 pounds, but he ran the fastest 40 time ever at 4.21 seconds. Now his size at 165 pounds is the same size as Tank Dell, who came out last year and had a great season for the Houston Texans, but he was in the perfect spot with a good quarterback in CJ Stroud, and I think Tank Dell was a better route runner than Xavier Worthy. Now the two big things that Worthy has in his favor is that elite 40 time, and then also he had 3 years, every year during college, producing at Texas. And the production was elite. It was legit. Right away as an 18-year-old in his freshman year, a true freshman, over 100 targets, 981 yards, follows that up with, again, over 100 targets, 760 yards, and then in his final year with Adonai Mitchell transferring to the program, a potential first-round pick in this draft class, he goes off for a career-high 1,000 yards, 75 catches. So here's kind of the conflicting question. A lot of these guys, these speedsters at this small of a size, 165 pounds, don't work out in the NFL, but Worthy has something that those guys didn't, and it was 3 years of elite college production. But when you go and look at his tape, a lot of his production is taking advantage of his speed, whether that's just downfield on go routes or in the screen department, which doesn't translate all that great to the NFL, which is why I'm dropping him a little bit. We have now graduated to my second tier, which is the 1,000-yard receiver. I could see this guy being a 1,000-yard receiver, having multiple 1,000-yard years in the NFL, and it starts with my number 8 receiver, Ricky Pearsall, who has been standing strong in my top 10 the entire offseason. Pearsall spent 5 seasons in college, starting his career with 3 years at Arizona State, where he had decent production before transferring to Florida. But Florida is where his career really took off. In 2022, 661 yards, but look at this, on only 33 catches. This dude was averaging 20 yards per catch, and then in 2023, his best season, doubles up his receptions with 65 and has almost 1,000 yards. Now at Florida, he spent most of his time in the slot, and in 2023, he was actually the most efficient slot receiver in the SEC. But don't just peg him as a slot-only receiver, because a year before that, in 2022, he was averaging 20 yards per catch. He was winning downfield, and he has the size to do so, 6'1" and 189 pounds. This isn't just like a prototypical guy in the slot only. So now his overall strengths are probably just his football IQ when it comes to route running. He knows how to get open, he knows how to fight through contact as well. So this was all great, and then he had a nice Senior Bowl performance in Mobile, Alabama, and then he goes to the NFL Combine and just lights it up. Look at all these. The higher they are to 100th percentile, the better. So his catch radius, elite. Agility score and burst score, elite. Runs a 4.41 40 time at 190 pounds. That's well above average, 71st percentile. So you're getting a guy who is a savvy route runner and now one of the best athletes at the wide receiver position in this class. It's hard not to like that. Ricky has only been rising throughout this entire process. I mean, look at this. Back in January, he was expected to go somewhere around like the 200th overall pick, and then it's just like a 5th or a 6th round pick. And now he's risen all the way to this point where he's actually projected to be a 2nd round pick, and not a late 2nd round pick, like midway through the 2nd round. But before the top 7 receivers, and one guy's actually dropped out of my top 5 that we haven't yet talked about, I just want to let you know about the fantasy blueprint. It might be early for some of you, but a lot of you are in dynasty leagues. If you want to win your fantasy league, this will help you do just that. It'll have everything you need to prepare for your drafts all summer long, beginning in June, going all the way until your fantasy playoffs during the season as well in December. And here's the most important part to let you know about. It's just $10 for the entire year, but if you don't make your fantasy playoffs, you get that $10 back. So it's either you make your fantasy playoffs and have a chance at the championship, or $10 back. So you can get your access to your blueprint today by clicking the link in the description below or scanning the QR code on the screen, and that is a limited time only risk-free offer. If you want to get it, now is the time. To the number 7 receiver we go, and it is Adonai Mitchell, who was a top 5 receiver for me, and he's dropped the more and more I watch his film and the more that I hear stuff out of what NFL teams think about it. Look, Adonai actually started his career at Georgia for 2 seasons. 2022 he was injured, but in 2021, not insane production his first year, 426 yards, but he was dealing with tough competition. Jermaine Burton, like we talked about earlier, Ladd McConkey, potential first-round pick, and Brock Bowers, a definite first-round pick. Now, before the 2023 season, he transferred to Texas, where he had a bigger role. He had a career-high 55 catches and 845 yards and a team-high 11 touchdowns. If you watch his film, there's a lot to like. I mean, this guy has elite speed. He flies by and glides by defenders. He can separate downfield, and honestly, in the red zone, there's not a lot of receivers better than him. Just by watching his tape, or even just some highlights, you could tell this guy is fast, but then he shows up to the combine, and at like 210 pounds, he runs a 4.34 40 times, something only 2 other receivers have done, Brian Thomas, who is in this draft class, and DK Metcalf. But the more that I watch his tape and I see all these great things, I also can't ignore the concerns. Adonai never broke out, and there are concerns around his effort in taking plays off. And a lot of scouts have pointed this out. If he's the 1st or 2nd read, he's going to be going all out. If he's the 3rd or 4th read, he's not going to sell his route. He's just going to kind of take the play off, is what they said. And the fact that he never broke out kind of makes him more of a projection into what he can be in the NFL when you look at past years type players with his profile. Now, despite that, I do believe he still has the upside to have a 1,000-yard season or a couple in the NFL, and I also think my wide receiver 6 does in Troy Franklin, who has moved up from being my wide receiver 9 earlier in the year to now being my wide receiver 6, and let's break down why. First off, he's an early declare, which we like to see. He only spent 3 years in college, and he's still just 21 years old, one of the youngest receivers in this class. And not only is he an early declare, but he had production in college. Right away in his second year, he breaks out at just 19 years old, almost 900 yards, 61 catches, and then he has the massive 2023 season, almost 1,400 yards, averaging 17 yards per catch and picking up 81 receptions. In 2023, he was the #1 graded PFF wide receiver, averaging 3.7 yards per route run. I mean, he was just a downfield weapon last season. He was productive and efficient against single coverage, not many guys better than him in the entire country. But there are concerns, and it starts with the fact that he was 176 pounds at the NFL Combine, and I actually think he probably played closer to like 165 to 170 pounds. He probably put on weight for the Combine. And then when you see his 40 time, it's not all that impressive. Like a 4.41 40 time, yeah, that's great, but when you factor in his size of 176 pounds, that thing has to be in the 4.3s and probably closer to like a 4.35 for him to really be elite speed. So now you start to get these concerns. He's a little bit smaller. His strength showed up on tape for jump balls. He wasn't all that great. And now he has just average speed for his smaller frame. And those points are important. If they're not important for you, they're important for NFL GMs. If you don't have size and you just have average speed and your strength at the catch point isn't there, then what are you in the NFL? And those are the concerns that keep him out of my top 5. Now we get to my top 5 receivers, and I introduce you to the first guy in our top tier, the wide receiver 1. This guy can be drafted and be a team's wide receiver 1 right away. And for me, that is Ladd McConkey, my number 5 receiver out of Georgia. Ladd spent 3 seasons at Georgia. As I've touched on a couple of times, there's a loaded wide receiver room there in 2021, and he was still able to put up 450 yards. Then he had his best year in 2022 of almost 800 yards. And then in 2023 was having a nice season, was really efficient until he battled some injuries and only played 9 games. And that 2023 year shouldn't be thrown out. I mean, his tape was incredible, and the guy was averaging over 3 yards per route run. He was a top 10 efficiency receiver in the entire nation before injury. What Ladd does best is his route running. He is a creative and elite route runner who wins off the line of scrimmage, and he is strong after the catch. And then he showed up to the NFL Combine and tested out way better than expected. He ran in the 4.3s, a 4.39, above average speed score and above average burst. Now, there's not a ton of downsides to his game. Maybe the most pressing and really one of the only ones is his downfield ability, like jump ball ability, but that's just not his game. His game is to be a technician and a route runner. Now, my number 4 receiver, who I also can think can be a wide receiver 1 right away, I think he'll be a first-round pick, is Brian Thomas Jr. out of LSU, and he continues to be in my top 5 wide receivers. Thomas spent 3 years at LSU, where the first 2 years he was just behind other guys who ended up going on to be pros or drafted in the NFL, like a Kayshon Boutte by the Patriots last year. But in 2023, he finally broke out while playing next to another elite receiver in Malik Nabers. He was still able to put up 1,200 yards, have 68 catches, and earn nearly 100 targets. So now, what is Brian Thomas's game? Well, it's elite speed and being a vertical threat. I mean, that's his game, basically. He was able to also win over 50% of his contested catches, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that is elite. Now, his production increased in 2023 because his skills improved. His route running, his release off the line, and his footwork all took a step forward. And then he only just poured gasoline on the fire when he went to the NFL Combine at 210 plus pounds and runs a 4.33 40 time, 99th percentile speed. His jumps, so his burst score, 83rd percentile, well above average. I mean, this guy is an athletic freak. If you want to talk about concerns to his game, it would probably be more of a limited route tree, although he just didn't have a chance to run a lot of other routes. He was kind of the vertical guy at LSU, and he didn't break out until his final year. And also, his player comparables will kind of scare you. The pass profiles that look like his, there's Martavis Bryant, which is great, but then there's also guys like a Jonathan Mingo and even a Quentin Johnson from just a year ago. But in the right landing spot, I do believe he could be a wide receiver 1 right away. Like right now, he's being mocked at the end of the first round, often to the Buffalo Bills. Now for our number 3 receiver, it is a guy who maybe you could even put these next couple of guys in a tier of their own. And I probably think this top tier wide receiver 1 could be broken up into like all pro type players, guys who can go for like over 1,300 yards in their first year. And one of those guys would be Rome Odunze, my number 3 receiver. This is what you need to know about Odunze. He's a jump ball receiver who can separate downfield and at the line of scrimmage thanks to his size, speed, and route running ability. If I'm being honest, I don't see a lot of flaws to his game. I mean, maybe yards after the catch, but that's just not the type of routes he was running to actually pick up a lot of yards after the catch. Now for my number 2 receiver, and this has become more of a debate recently, is it Marvin Harrison or is it Malik Nabers, the number 2 receiver in the class? For me, it is going to be Malik Nabers out of LSU. And look, this dude is super young. He's still just 20 years old. He's an early declare, only spent 3 years in college, and just had a 1,500 yard season last season at LSU. And his most comparable players right now are Amari Cooper and Antonio Brown, which shows you just how good he is, and here's what makes him great. Nabers can win in the slot and out wide. He is great on the top of his routes, and his footwork and explosiveness is like that of an elite running back. Honestly, his only downside is that there's another receiver in this draft named Marvin Harrison Jr. And Marvin Harrison out of Ohio State, also an early declare. He's 21 years old, and he had multiple seasons of great college production of over 1,200 yards and 14 touchdowns back-to-back years in the Big Ten. And according to JJ Zach Arison's late round prospect guide, here are Marvin Harrison's analytical comparisons. AJ Green, CeeDee Lamb, and Julio Jones. I mean, that's unbelievable, but if you just turn on this guy's tape or even highlights for like 5 seconds, you'll probably realize why. Harrison is an elite route runner who always seems to be 3 steps ahead of defensive backs. And the main knock against him was that he's just not great after the catch, which sure, he's not the best after the catch, but he showed progression in that area from 2022 to 2023. According to PFF, he gained 50% more yards after the catch per reception in 2023. So these are my top 20 wide receivers for this year's 2024 NFL draft. And yeah, if you really wanted to nitpick it, you can add an extra tier and put Marvin Harrison, Malik Neighbors, and even maybe Rome Odunze in their own tier, but I just broke it up as guys who can be wide receiver ones, and I think those 5 can be depending on landing spot. Now, I've also released a couple other videos this offseason of the most overlooked rookies across all offensive positions, as well as the top 10 running backs in this class, and you can see these videos on the screen right now. If you want to check them out, be sure to click.